James, for that very generous introduction. I'm kind of reminded of a distinction that we make between an Australian boomerang and an Irish boomerang. That an Australian boomerang, you throw it, and eventually it comes back. An Irish boomerang, you throw it, it sings about coming back, but it never does. So I've decided last year that I would do the singing bit, and this year I'm doing the coming back bit. And it is, I have to say, a kind of unadulterated pleasure to be back here in the NIDA school. Last year I was greatly honoured to be the NIDA professor, and it was an extraordinary kind of week, really, of engagement, of dialogue, that began in the kind of the early hours of the morning, continued on till the early hours of the morning, and the hospitality, the warmth, the generosity. In particular, I think one of the things that strikes me about the NIDA school is just the kind of range and breadth of linguistic and geographical and cultural origin, because one of the things that has bedeviled translation studies over the years is what I call geopolitical prejudice, the tendency to come from a particular part of the world, talk about particular issues that reflect the ideological preoccupations of a particular part of the planet, and tend to lack the kind of breadth and diversity that I think characterises the school in the composition of its associates and the people that are invited. So I think this is really very much a virtue. What I'm going to talk about this morning, if I can get this up again, is basically something that's related to this most recent project of mine, which is looking at the notion of echo or eco translation. I just want to put this into a little bit of context. The World Meteorological Organization on the 21st of March issued its kind of annual update on the state of the planet, because the 23rd of March is World Meteorology Day. So looking at the planet in 2016, as you probably all know, it was the warmest year on record, so it's 1.1 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial period. Surface temperatures on the planet are the warmest on record. Global sea levels are rising again at unprecedented levels. The global sea ice extent in the month of November alone shrank by 4 million square kilometers. And of course, at the end of 2015, carbon dioxide levels were 400 parts per million, which is symbolically is a very dangerous kind of level to reach. So in other words, despite the fact that in 1990 it was established as a fairly clear scientific fact that we were in trouble in terms of carbon dioxide emissions, between 1990 and 2016, carbon dioxide emissions have increased by 60%. So one of the questions I began to ask myself was, translation, if you looked at over the centuries in terms of global migration, in terms of trade, in terms of the Reformation, the Enlightenment, the spread of liberalism, the spread of communism, has been something that has both been a medium of and something that's been influenced by these very wide, large transnational movements. So then I began to ask myself the question, if this is the case, if translation is both something that is instrumental to and affected by these major transnational phenomena, what about the single greatest challenge that our planet is facing in this century and for centuries to come, the ecological question of climate change? What is the particular kind of relationship between climate change, ecology, and what translation does and what translators do? Now, to some extent, I'd be the first person to think about the notion of translation and ecology. Chinese scholars had been working on the question of eco-translatology for a number of years, but what they were primarily concerned with was looking at ecological science and what kinds of analytic instruments, concepts you could take from the science of ecology to look at, if you like, translation in context. You had Clive Scott, who's mentioned yesterday, whose notion of eco-translation is looking at the text as a kind of an ecological niche, and it's the various factors or parts of that ecological niche that affects how you will respond to, interpret, and look at the text. But my approach, if you like, was coming at it from a quite different angle, and that is the angle, if you like, of political ecology. In other words, that if we think about the notion of the new geological age that we've entered into, the Anthropocene, where, if you like, geological change is now driven by human activities, that humans are no longer, if you like, a part of this much larger thing called the environment, but have now the kind of the geological force of earthquakes, the geological force of the shift of tectonic plates. What does that mean? When you move from being a biological agent to a geological agent, what are the consequences, what are the political consequences of that? So basically the kind of notion of translation that I'm looking at is considering that shift in status for humans, what this means in terms of how we think about translation. This is partly prompted by work that was being done by Rosa Bradotti on the notion of the post-human, where basically one of the consequences that Bradotti argues of climate change is that we're forced to think about a post-anthropocentric world. In other words, that one of the consequences of climate change, of the kind of ecological paradigm, is that we can no longer see humans as this kind of supremely all-powerful agent that exists in splendid isolation. That the fate of humans is inextricably bound up with the non-human world, and the fate of the non-human world is inextricably bound up with humans. So having a notion of a kind of an anthropocentric or human-centered history no longer makes sense, because we now have the convergence of geological, non-human history and human history, as Chakrabarty argued in his notion of deep history. So what Bradotti argues for then is a notion of what she calls the transversal subject. So in other words, that a notion of subjectivity must factor in the non-human. We must think about how the human translation in this respect, because there are sort of, and there are two aspects to this. This is the most recent work from the primatologist Frans de Waal, with one of the best titles I think I've come across in recent years for a book. Talking about transversal subjectivity, if we're talking about the relationship of the human to the non-human, to other animal species, to the inorganic world, well, what we're talking about is the relationship of the human to other things or species that are at some level incommensurable. And this kind of relationship between the incommensurable. So thinking about incommensurability, thinking about commensurability means that you have to think about translation. In other words, how can you have any notion of transversal subjectivity if you don't have some ethics of translation, some way of thinking through how those kinds of relationships are going to happen. So whether it's in the area of interspecies communication, how we kind of relate to the species that are part of the planet, that's a part of the community of living beings that make up the planet, or whether we think in the sense that Elizabeth Povinelli has argued in terms of what she calls geontology, where the geontological is, this is work that she, or a concept that she formulated on the basis of her work with Aboriginal peoples in Australia, where the notion that there was some kind of special, distinct status for the human, as distinct from a status for rocks or trees or rivers or plants, that this didn't make sense in many of the Aboriginal cosmologies, that they didn't see this kind of hard and fast link. And of course, this in terms of, she's describing Aboriginal cosmologies, but as the Brazilian anthropologist Eduardo Viveiros de Castro points out, when he looks at Amerindian cosmologies, basically what they're describing, this sense of the lack of clear demarcations between human and non-human, is precisely the kinds of cosmologies that we need to think about a future, where of course, because of climate change, because of the very dramatic shifts that will take place ecologically, we have to radically rethink the relationship between the human and the non-human. And this is why he refers to Amerindian cosmologies in cannibal metaphysics as cosmologies of the future, rather than cosmologies of some kind of so-called primitive or remote past. So, in other words, both in terms of some of the work that's going on in interspecies communication, looking at various forms of animal mindedness, looking at the work that's going on in anthropological sense around this concept of geo-ontology, I began to, if you like, think about what it means for translation to be part of that particular debate. So in this book that I did, just before I go on to that, I just want to briefly mention the work that people like Timothy Morton have been doing in the kind of philosophical area of speculative realism, where basically Morton argues, and this is in his kind of critique of Kantian idealism, that there's far much or too much attention has been given to what he would call kind of subjective hubris, and the notion of the human subject as kind of conceptualizing, creating, engendering a particular world. And he would see that climate change is to some extent the revenge of objects. It's the sort of the objects come back and they bite you. What it is kind of challenging this notion of kind of subjective domination or supremacy. So it's this kind of notion of hyper-objects, and a hyper-object is something that is vastly extended in space and time, that at any one moment we come into contact with a part of this object, but it is too vast and too extended for us to grasp it in its entirety. And one of those hyper-objects, he would argue, is climate change itself. So if you like, in terms of the kind of movement that's coming through in speculative realism, what's happening in animal studies, what's happening in anthropology, geontology, it's kind of pointing through, from my perspective, the value or the usefulness of thinking about translation as a way of engaging with a lot of these debates, because unless there's some notion, reflection on thinking about translation and translatability, about dealing with notions of the incommensurable, it seems to me that a lot of the thinking in these areas will very, very quickly run into difficulty. So in the book Echo Translation that James mentioned, it was basically to try and begin this debate in translation studies. And so basically I look at four different areas: the area of food, the area of interspecies communication, the area of travel writing, and the area that I'm going to talk about this morning, which is the area of technology. In looking at technology, I wanted to begin with a book by the German author Hans Fallada called Arne Gustav. This is basically a kind of novel that describes the fortunes of a German family in the First World War, the period after the First World War, a period of the Weimar Republic. The main character in the book is a man called Gustav Hackendal, and Gustav Hackendal runs a very, very successful cab company in Berlin. So he has 50 horses bringing these cabs all around Berlin. And there's a particular kind of moment just before the First World War where cars begin to appear on the streets of Berlin. And at one particular point in the novel, as the fortunes of the Hackendal family begin to decline, as things get very, very difficult, Hackendal thinks back on his life, and he said, the day it all went wrong was the day I had the race with the car. So what he does is his son has a motor car. He's taking one of his clients to the hospital. So there's a kind of a race between the son and the motor car and the father with the hansom cab and the horse. They're both going to the... and of course what happens is that the horse, at one point, he's ahead, but then he gets frightened by the noise of the other cars, and eventually he tears off through the streets of Berlin. The son, on the other hand, arrives safely at the hospital with his client in the motor car. So what Hackendal argues is that what he calls these benzene stinkers, which he thought had no future, there's no future for these smelly, noisy, awful clanking contraptions, that this, if you like, fossil fuel driven object emerges triumphant. So basically there's a kind of an argument here that that modernism or the history of modernism is very much bound up with a particular kind of fossil fuel technology, which is embodied by the particular car that the Gustav Hackendal's son is driving. We could argue that Hackendal was right, that modernity, as we define it, is very much bound up with the kinds of technologies which are driven very much by the fossil fuel. Of course, the difference, and this is what I'm going to be dwelling on this morning, is the crucial difference for our own time is that increasingly those technologies have shifted from the mechanical to the virtual. Right? If you think in the year 2000, about 740 million people on the planet had mobile phones. Now around 6 billion people have mobile phones on the planet. So something like 90 out of every 100 people on the planet have a mobile phone or access to a mobile phone. We know that internet connectivity is increasing exponentially despite the digital divide every year. So there's a sense in which the kinds of technologies that we have are evolving continuously. There's kind of Moore's law about the processing power increasing or doubling every 2 years, but more importantly is if we take between 2000 and 2015, the software processing power has increased by a factor of 64,000. So in other words, these technologies are developing extremely fast and at an unprecedented rate. But of course, one of the arguments that's been put forward by people like Ethan Zuckerman is that this technology carries with it extraordinary forms of utopian promise. In other words, that with the arrival of virtual technologies, with the arrival of mobile connectivity, with the arrival of the internet, we are getting the chance to create an unprecedented sense of global sharing, an unprecedented sense of global community, an unprecedented sense of global connectedness in various forms. Now, this is not unusual. If you look at the emergence of the telegraph, if you look at the emergence of the radio, if you look at the emergence of cinema, all of those forms of technology were accompanied by a certain kind of utopian rhetoric. That as the technology was allowing all kinds of connections to happen materially, it was also allowing all kinds of connections to happen politically, psychologically, sociologically, and so on. And of course, if you look at a lot of the kind of cyber utopianism that you find in Silicon Valley, it's very much connected to that kind of utopian promise. Zuckerman, who heads up the sort of the Media Lab in MIT, begs to differ. In this book, Rewire, from 2013, where he looks at the notion of digital cosmopolitanism, he basically argues that there is a difference between the cyber-utopian promise of the internet and the user's actual practice. So there's a whole kind of battery of statistics to show that in terms of the sites that people consult, the language in which they consult them, they are overwhelmingly sites that are related to their own country, their own culture, and in their own language. If you take something like Facebook, it is estimated, for example, that out of every 100 Facebook friends, that at least 14 of them are outside of your own country or kind of geographical area. Now, you might think that's pretty good, 14 out of every 100. But the problem about that is those statistics are aggregated. So, for example, a young Indian PhD student in New York who might have maybe sort of 85 to 90 of his Facebook friends from back in India, those figures then would be put into the pot so they kind of get aggregated so that the number of Facebook friends is kind of artificially pumped up by the fact that a certain group of people have an awful lot of people from outside their geographical jurisdiction. But once you kind of begin to winnow that out, you find, in fact, that people's connectivity tends to be very much confined to their own culture, language, and geographical area. So one of the things that Zuckerman argues is that what this cyber-utopian promise is doing, it's failing to engage, failing to think about the notion of the multilingual. And he says, a connected world is a polyglot world. As we gain access to the thoughts, feelings, and opinions of people around the world, our potential for knowledge and understanding expands, but so does our capacity to misunderstand. As we become more connected, we're able to comprehend a smaller and smaller fraction of the conversations we encounter without help and interpretation. So he basically argues then that this is where translation comes into the picture. That one of the things that translation can do is precisely to allow for these connections to be made, to allow for the conversation to extend outside one's own geographical, cultural, and linguistic area. And one of the things that translators do is they act as these kind of cultural mediators in this new kind of cyber dialogue. You could argue that's true. In translation studies, we've known this for a long time. But how is this going to happen? Well, he classically argues that the way in which this is going to happen is through two things. One is the use of translation technology, so the use of machine translation in various forms, and the other is through volunteer translation. So I'm going to say a little bit more about volunteer translation a little later, but let's just stick with the notion of translation technology. So what people, commonly the kind of Google Translate paradigm, that basically we have these kind of automatic or semi-automatic technologies that will allow for this kind of cyber conversation to occur or take place. One of the problems with that is that something that seems to be attractive, something that seems to invoke translation or to invoke Jerome as part of the creation of cyber connectivity, ignores something that seems to me to be quite crucial and something I'm going to dwell on slightly at length this morning, which is the notion of what I would call the resource unconscious. One of the points that's made by this young Belgian philosopher Pascal Chabot in this L'Âge des Transitions came out in 2015, is he argues for a thing called transitology. And basically transitology is the ideological or a system of thought that would allow for the great transition from a carbon to a post-carbon society. In other words, how would you conceptualize the notion of subjects, the notion of objects, the notion of relationships, human practices in a post-carbon society? One of the things that he argues is that there is what he calls the black box in our society. And our black box is usually something that is to do with energy sources. So if you scour the literature of classical antiquity and you look for a description or debate or analysis of the single greatest source of energy in antiquity, you would be hard pushed to find any description or extended discussion of it, which is slavery. Human slavery was one of the most crucial sources of energy in antiquity. If we look at the literature of the 19th and 20th centuries, of course we can talk about Zola, of course we can refer to Dickens. I've just referred briefly here to Hans Fallada, but most literature in the 1920s and 1920s remains pretty silent on the subject of fossil fuels. You do not get extended descriptions, invocations, analysis, interpretations of the primary source of energy that allows all of these activities in the society to happen. So this is what he calls the black box, the way in which the kind of the energy sources in the society are silenced. And this is what he calls the tendency to privilege ends over means. In other words, we privilege mobility, we privilege comfort, we privilege access, connectivity, but we tend not to dwell too much on how we get there. What kinds of energy sources are we using? What are the kind of consequences of extractivism, of the use of these particular energy sources? So this black box, which I'll refer to as the resource unconscious, is something that it seems to me is that we have to think about in terms of what is the relationship between translation and technology and the use of energy in terms of creating some notion of a viable or a sustainable future for humanity and the different parts of it. If we look at this resource unconscious in terms of the kinds of technologies that we use, there are three, if you like, factors that immediately spring to mind. If I think of what I have in my pocket there, if I think of what's here in front of me, if I look at what's on most of your tables, they are objects that contain a quite large number of precious, rare metals. In some cases, metals that are quite toxic in terms of their extraction. So a typical kind of iPhone, we find aluminium, antimony, arsenic, bismuth, cadmium, chromium, copper, ferrite, gold, indium, lead, nickel, platinum, steel, silver, tin and zinc. So before some of you decide to disassemble your iPhone in the hope of being the kind of the gold diggers, they tend to be in fairly minute quantities. But you can imagine the kind of cumulative effect of the kind of extractive industries that are necessary for this to happen. So the actual physical objects that we have in front of us that we're using to do our translation tasks, to access our translations, to work as translators, are connected in a very real and material way to fairly toxic forms of extractivism across the planet. The second thing is what happens when you decide to upgrade to a new version of the Mac or a laptop or a phone. You're told that it gets recycled, but who's doing the recycling? And then when you begin to look at the recycling practices, you find they're primarily done in countries with very lax environmental legislation, very lax environmental regulation, done in very many instances by underage children or several generations of a family with very low life expectancy as a result of the hazardous or toxic chemicals to which they are exposed. And then, of course, there's the fact that as we shift from what's called fixed to nomadic forms of computing, so we move from the desktop to the laptop, we begin to find that energy consumption increases exponentially. Now, initially, of course, laptops were more energy efficient than desktops. But the problem was that as computers became more portable, people began to use them more often. So the energy consumption, in fact, increased. There's also the fact that if you have an Ethernet cable and plug your computer into the wall, it's going to consume a certain amount of energy. But when you go on to a 3G network, the energy consumption will increase by a factor of 15. When you move to a 4G network, the energy consumption increases by a factor of 23. When you go to a 5G network, the energy consumption increases by a factor of 65. So as we move, if you like, to more and more kind of mobile or wireless forms of computing, and this is very much a part of our kind of translation practice, the actual energy consumption itself is something that's beginning to increase exponentially. So in other words, in terms of the kind of black box, in terms of the resource unconscious, it's something that's feeding, if you like, the particular kind of movement or a fundamental shift that imperils the kind of planet in which we live. There's also, of course, the fact that there's a kind of endless growth in what's called bit rate content, which is basically the idea that more and more of the content that we look on in our computers is video content, is live streaming of one kind or the other. If you were to put the entire content of the English language version of Wikipedia on DVD, it's about 9 gigaoctets. You could do that with 2 DVDs. If I was to watch an episode of The Simpsons, I would need somewhere in the order of the Simpsons series, I would need something at the order of 5 DVDs. Right? But if we look at kind of streamed video content, which was kind of 57% of internet usage in 2012, it's now gone up to 69%. This is the higher the rate, the bit rate of content, the more energy hungry it becomes. There's also users' expectations. Is the more you get used to streamed video content of a high quality, the higher and higher quality you want it to be. The higher and higher the quality, the greater and greater the definition, the more energy you need to consume in order to produce this. And of course, as we move towards the Internet of all things, where everything will be fitted, if you like, with a radio frequency identification device, so the idea of that all of the object world will be connected in a way to the Internet, which allows you to do various things, the energy consumption, the potential for energy consumption, is something that rises exponentially. So, I've painted a very, very bleak picture there of the kind of the resource consequences of what we do in our daily lives with the particular kind of machines that we use to drive current forms of translation practice, and as part of the kind of translation and connectivity that Zuckerman sees as part of the new digital utopia. The difficulty, of course, with that is the cyber despair then turns to a kind of technophobia. Now, why this is not tenable is at 2 levels. One is in terms of the work that Timothy Taylor has done in paleo anthropology, where Taylor's argument is that he sees humans as a perfect example of what he calls the survival of the weakest. Because when you think about it, we have a lousy back, and 40% or more of us will develop back pain by the time we reach the age of 45. Our eyesight is pretty poor. We have teeth that are a joke in terms of other animal primates. Look at the covering that we have against extreme cold and extreme warmth. It's not much good. We are 3, 4, 5 by the time we can kind of properly dress ourselves, feed ourselves, survive. In the case of some children that I know, this lasts to the age of 30 and 35. I should not mention any names. In other words, that we are spectacularly ill-equipped for the world into which we are born. And he sees that the crucial kind of differentiating factor is the acquisition of tools. It's so discovery of fire, the making of tools, weapons, and so on allows humans to cook food, to build shelters, to make clothes or coverings of various kinds. So in other words, without resorting to kind of techno-determinism, Taylor would argue that the notion of our engagement with tools and with techne is a consubstantial part of our humanity, that it's kind of conceive of our humanity without the deep involvement with techne. And of course, what we know as translators is that most of us nowadays really are not so much translators as translational cyborgs. And the most famous one of all, of course, the protocol droid from Star Wars, C-3PO, who had a modest 6 million forms of communication. But what, if you like, the notion of the translation cyborg, which is kind of first developed by Doug Robinson, is the way in which we interact with our computers, with blogs, with translator fora, the way we get embedded in particular kinds of translation networks where part of the work is done by translation memories, part of the work is done by machine translation systems, part of the work is done by human translators. So the notion of some kind of an ability to exist outside of this is no longer tenable. But more importantly, of course, this is a historical lineage. One of the things that I argued in Translation in the Digital Age is the invention of writing, the invention of the manuscripts, the invention of the printing press. All of these are forms of technology that fundamentally altered or shaped the way in which translation was practiced, disseminated, articulated, and so on. So if you like, in terms of where we are as humans and where we are as translators, that despite the deeply kind of toxic effects of particular kinds of virtual practice, we can't kind of disengage or disentangle ourselves in some form of kind of technophobic purity. This is simply not a kind of an operable or a viable transition. Of course, one of the factors that we've got to think about in terms of, if we think back to Zuckerman's argument that we need to have translation there in the virtual world in order for connectivity to happen, well, you could argue that this is precisely what's happening with the localization industry. I mean, what the localization industry is doing, it is understood that we live in a multilingual world. It says that you can only sell goods and services if you offer people websites and material in their own languages and is adapted to their own cultures. And the basic reason for that, the basic kind of raison d'etre, is that you will sell more goods, you will sell more services. And of course, if we look at recent statistics from the US Trade Bureau, the industry that's predicted to have the highest growth in the United States in the next 5 years is translation. Translation is expected to grow by 42% in a 5-year period. So in other words, this is exponential growth. And when you think about it, what is driving then that exponential growth in translation? What is driving the localization industry? It is precisely an ideology of infinite growth, an ideology of infinite expansion, the infinite consumption of goods and services, precisely the kind of productivism, precisely the kind of growth paradigm that is feeding the particular kind of ecological dilemma in which we we find ourselves. So on the one hand, you have this kind of notion of the kind of inextricable link to technology. On the other, you have a kind of a practice which is fueled, if you like, by technological enablement, but it is engendering the kind of feeding as part of the crisis that's brought the planet to the kind of sorry place that it is today. So, I've talked about translation, I've talked about technology. I must also think about the third T in my list of T's there, which is time. I'm going to get my watch here so that I won't run over time. Oh dear, I didn't realize it was that time. Zuckerman.
We started late, so don't worry.
Good. A bit more. So Zuckerman argues that, as I said earlier, that the two ways of arriving at this technological enablement are through the use of volunteer translators or through the use of technology. Let me just briefly describe the two ways that he's proposing. One is he takes the example of the Yan site, which was set up by a number of Chinese translators who basically wanted to look at how China was reported in various media across the world. So there are now more than 100,000 of these volunteer translators who are kind of working on these particular translating material for this website. So this kind of notion, you get this with TED Talks, you get it with Facebook, the idea that you get volunteer translators to translate the material. And of course, Zuckerman sees this in an extremely positive light. This is translators who are offering their skills, who are getting involved in promoting a sense of connectivity, global dialogue, and so on. The other solution that is proposed is I forgot to put that, is the ray capture. You probably have seen this before. It's when you go onto a website and you will often be asked to type in, you see these kind of words, right? And you'll be asked to type in this word to show that you're not an automatic piece of software, that you're a human being. Well, of course, this was the brainchild of a man called Luis von Ahn. And basically, every time you type in these words, you're in fact helping to transcribe a book. So from 2008 onwards, more than 100 books a day were being transcribed using. So this is what's called human computation. So basically, you take all the tiny inputs of users right across the planet, and you harness that kind of collective human computational power in order to transcribe these books. His idea for the internet is that you would do a similar thing. That basically, people who are taking Duolingo, that the app to learn foreign languages, which of course many of us here have probably downloaded. It's great fun in the beginning. And you speed through the first few lessons, and then, well, you begin to run out of time and you begin to ignore all those reminders and so on. But anyway, if you persevere, and you get to the higher levels, his idea is that people will be sent sentences to translate. So translate them into Portuguese, whatever the language might be. And this way, it would be possible eventually to translate all of the content of the internet, that you would harness this vast computational power coming through Duolingo to translate all of the content on the internet. But of course, this is where, again, the resource unconscious begins to kick in. Because what we're talking about there is the bringing together of very, very large amounts of data. And that means the creation of data centers. There's nothing more material than the virtual. There's nothing more material in its consequences than the virtual. That the notion of the cloud is a misnomer. The real cloud are vast data centers which consume vast amounts of energy, Last year alone, data centers consumed 3 times more than the total output of renewable energy sources on the planet. They also occupy very, very large tracts of arable land. They are often a source of noise and light pollution and so on. So in other words, again, you see the kind of the resource underbelly, kind of the black box that's concealed in this kind of cyber utopian promise. But I want to say a little bit more about the what he, in terms of the labor, the kind of notion of activist translation here, and the kind of volunteer translation, which has become very popular in translation circles. One of the points that's made by the thinker Mackenzie Wark is there's what he calls the labor perspective. And this is basically the idea that, or the labor point of view. He says that one of the things that people tend to dwell on is what he calls the language of molecular drama. So this is the idea of man against nature, or man against the gods. And there's less interest in what he calls the molecular. This is the view from the ground. And I quote, "It is the molecular scale which corresponds best to the labour point of view. If nature is that which resists labour, it does so in a granular way. The molar is the language of management. It's the dialogue of ideas in which experiences of those who organise labour substitute for the experience of those whose labour organises the world directly." So one of the things that I would argue is that if we have a transition to what I would call a low-tech form of translation, that we could begin to challenge an economic model that pursues infinite growth at the expense of sustainable and meaningful employment. So what I mean by this is that there are 2 ways. One is what I would call supply side ecology, and the other is demand side ecology. So what I mean by kind of supply side ecology is in terms of the actual devices that we have. So in other words, how we design our devices. So the kinds of materials that we put into them, the kinds of mode of production. If we use a modular, for example, mode of production, it's much easier to repair or to recycle these particular things. How they are recycled, if you control, regulate in a much more meaningful way how these are to be recycled. So this is in terms of the kind of the supply side ecology. You can change things in terms of the shift to what are called low-tech forms of the internet. So if you look at internet networks in Kerala, in India, in Catalonia, in northern Spain, where they're recycling, if you like, older forms of equipment to create, if you like, internet networks that are fairly easy or light on the environment, on the surrounding area, you begin to get an idea of how you might develop from a supply side ecology different approaches to technology. The use of what are called data mules. So this is basically a bus that's equipped with a form of connectivity, that as the bus goes around from village to village, it picks up kind of emails or electronic data that is stored at particular kind of nodal points in the village. So the bus itself, if you like, becomes part of the network or the system. If it's an electric powered bus, obviously that diminishes the ecological footprint and so on. So that, if you like, is from the point of view of a sort of a supply side ecology. But in terms of a demand side ecology, things become slightly more complicated. In other words, in terms of people's expectations, in terms of people's habits, how do we, if you like, alter or change how they're going to relate to their surrounding world? And this applies to translation. So one of the questions we can ask ourselves is more translation better? is the notion of increased translation, of expanding translation infinitely. Is this of necessity a good thing? Is this a desirable good? Is it something that we should aspire to? Or is there a sense in which translation, a kind of paradigm of infinite growth, the kind of the growth paradigm that's very much part of particular forms of Western development and extractivism, is this not something that needs to be challenged in terms or in the name of something that we might call digital frugality, digital connoisseurship? In other words, that we decide that certain things are socially, culturally, politically, economically more valuable or more important to translate than other things. But translation per se is not necessarily a virtue. It's the kinds of things that we use translation for, and how do we use translation in a way that is ecologically responsible as opposed to ecologically irresponsible. So this notion then of a demand-side ecology is to see the primary challenge as the one of reducing the level of demand for goods and services to environmentally sustainable levels. So demand in this scenario involves choice and discernment. Less is more. So the task then becomes a kind of an ethical one of allocating scarce translation resources, scarce because they're dependent on the material infrastructure, the infrastructural unconscious of material economy, to the development of a just, sustainable and resilient society, ensuring the survival of the planet and the species that dwell on it. Donna Haraway has argued that information is not simply a convenient metaphor for describing forms of causality in the world, it also becomes a powerful means of organizing worlds. She says, communication science and modern biologies are constructed by a common move. The translation of the world into a problem of coding, a search for a common language in which all resistance to instrumental control disappears, and all heterogeneity can be submitted to disassembly, assembly, investment and exchange. A similar kind of notions there, namely Apter's work on the translation zone, the kind of the notion of this kind of digital or binary translatability. So in Haraway's vision of techno-science in a commodity economy, translation becomes the instrument of the destruction, not the promotion, of heterogeneity. Translation underpins the move towards the construction of a common language that spells the end of resistance, the surrender to the command and control of instrumental digital reason. So the sense, I would argue, in which the pressures to embrace a common language, which kind of subtending a particular version of the digital, is I think, and this is the kind of what I want to conclude with, is already there in the way in which we think about language, knowledge, and translation. The sociologist Boaventura Sousa Santos coined the term epistemicide to describe the way in which Western science has marginalized or eradicated the knowledge systems of non-Western countries. So the kinds of knowledges they have in mind: traditional medicines, community justice systems, and local law relating to the natural world. The British thinker Karen Bennett, who works in Lisbon, has explored this notion of epistemicide in the expansion, or the context of the expansion and hegemony of what she calls English academic discourse, precisely the kind of discourse that I'm using here now. She says the internationalization or globalization of the university system in the past 3 decades has seen a commensurate rise in what she calls quantitative comparability. So if you think QS World University Rankings, the Times Higher Educational World University Rankings, the Centre for World University Rankings, the Academic Ranking of World Universities, All of these purport to rank the quality of universities worldwide largely on the basis of quantitative data. So this move towards international comparability feeds international research exercises that in turn privilege quantitative outputs to determine who or what should get funding. The difficulty is that the language, or more particularly a single language, English, becomes the medium of comparison. In other words, for an article or a book to be deemed international, it must almost invariably be published in English. Non-native speakers of English who wish to access funding and promotional opportunities have either to write directly in English or have recourse to translation into English. And this, of course, obligation is not epistemically innocent. As Chip Bruce and Maureen Hogan point out, tools that are habitually used become invisible. We might say, I talked to my friend today without feeling any need to mention that the telephone was necessary for that conversation to occur. In other words, the tool itself becomes invisible. You don't mention that or specify that. And of course, we could say that English at some level has become that kind of tool. But of course, the tool itself is going to determine, at least in part, the kinds of conversations that you're going to have. And what Bennett argues is that this goes back to the problem that this poses. It sets up a kind of an opposition between a particular kind of discourse that's rooted in 17th century English scientific discourse, along with the scientific revolution, where, if you like, language is seen as a kind of transparent medium for the expression of things. That what language does is that it, in a simple, spare, unpretentious, unmetaphorical, unfigurative way, describes the world, and that this, if you like, this particular kind of tradition is radically different from a European Renaissance scholastic tradition, where language is seen as part of those things that actually engenders or brings the world into being. So that philosophical traditions such as hermeneutics, German idealism, phenomenology, existentialism, structuralism, post-structuralism are very much bound up with what you would see as a kind of continuity with some of the linguistic features of this particular kind of tradition. So what then is, the point that Bennett is making is that what we find with the ascendancy of English as an academic discourse is that a particular kind of rhetorical and philosophical paradigm that's rooted in a specific historical tradition is now kind of epistemically devouring other ways and approaches to thinking about language, society, and culture. So this kind of epistemicide that's bound up with academic discourse, which of course has been powerfully propagated by the uses of internet technology, is something that, again, I think we can kind of link back to this notion of what is the point of challenging the resource unconscious? What is the point of thinking about the kind of infrastructural unconscious? Well, I would argue that one of the points of thinking about it is that it's forcing us to think about viability, sustainability. As Naomi Klein says, we don't have a choice because if we do nothing, something will happen anyway, and something very bad will happen. And one of the ways, if you like, of dealing or addressing this is precisely to challenge the various forms of epistemicide, the various forms of thinking about languages and cultures that are promoting a particular kind of monolingual and monocultural ideology or almost theology of infinite growth. But in order to do that, it seems to me that as translators, we have to be much more self-reflexive about our material practices. In other words, we do tend to think more and more about historical factors, about political factors, about sociological factors, but not just about texts and languages, but about translators as agents. But I think we need to think about non-human agency and translation. I think we need to think about about the material unconscious, the black box, in terms of our translational practice. Because there's little point, if you like, as translators in trying to transform the world if there's no longer a world left to transform. But I realize the third T, I think I've probably run out of at this stage time, so I'll stop there. Thank you.